He was drunk. He said to me, "Celeste, I regret marrying you." Almost at that moment, I realized that he didn't love me. I had accompanied him through all kinds of hardships. In the end, I bought a 28 yuan ring and ended this marriage. Hugh had drunk too much. His friend called me and asked me to pick him up at a small restaurant. People were coming and going. When I went in, I saw him leaning back in his chair with a faint smile on his face. The moment he saw me, that smile disappeared from his face without a trace. I walked up to him, wrinkled my brow when I smelled the alcohol and cigarette smoke on him, and scolded him in a low voice. "Didn't I tell you not to drink before you went out? Why did you drink so much?" He looked at me and curled his lips. "I'm happy." His tone rose, and he really did look happy. I helped him up, and he put his arm around my shoulder. I thought he was going to say goodbye to his friends, but then I saw that he walked up to a woman and said, "See you again when we're free." The woman hummed in response and said in not-so-standard Mandarin, "Sure, we'll definitely meet again." This girl was from Jiangnan. He stared straight at this person for a long time before walking back to me. He said to me, "Celeste, let's go home." He staggered out the door. I said something to his friends and followed him out the door. As soon as I got out, I saw him lighting a cigarette. Before he could bring it to his lips, I snatched it away, stubbed it out in the roadside trash can, and threw it in. Then I walked forward without looking back. Usually, when he saw me angry, he would call out to me and coax me for a long while. But not today. He just followed me silently all the way. That night, when we were lying in bed after taking a bath, he suddenly said, "Celeste, I regret marrying you." He narrowed his eyes slightly, staring straight at me. I thought he was joking. I let out a low laugh and kicked him. "What are you talking about?" And he repeated it again. To prove that he wasn't joking. A sour feeling welled up in my heart, flooding over me. It was really painful. The smile that had been on my face froze, and I couldn't smile at all anymore. I stared at the person on the bed, but he closed his eyes and stopped looking at me. By the time I wanted to ask him clearly, he was already fast asleep. I went to the second bedroom by myself and tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. I kept thinking about the reason why he said those words today. I thought about it over and over again countless times but still couldn't figure it out. When I went to make breakfast in the morning, I was suddenly hugged. He rested his chin on my shoulder and rubbed my cheek, asking me in a low voice, "Celeste, why didn't you sleep in the master bedroom last night?" I just smiled without answering. After a long while, when he asked me for the second time, I said softly, "You drank too much last night. I didn't want to sleep with you." "Then I won't drink next time." He said this while kissing me. I turned my head to avoid him. Then I slowly walked out with the plate in my hands. He saw that there was only one portion on the table and asked me, "Celeste, what am I going to eat?" I looked up at him. "I didn't know what time you would wake up today, so I didn't make any for you. You'd better go out and buy something to eat." I had been in a relationship with Hugh for 5 years and married to him for 4 years. But it was only last night that I realized that he didn't like me. He only said that he regretted it on that drunken night. After that, he acted as if nothing had happened. But I still had my doubts. When I went to his company, in his office, I saw the woman who had dinner with him that day. She was leaning against Hugh's desk, chatting and laughing with him. The moment I opened the door, the woman suddenly stood up. She said to Hugh, "President, I'll go out first. Yolanda, take this file to the finance department." He handed her a file in an attempt to cover up something, and she walked out slowly. This was the second time I had seen her. And I had only seen her twice. I stared at her for a few seconds and then placed Hugh's lunchbox on the table. He stood up, pulled me into his arms, and asked me in a low voice, "Celeste, why are you here?" I looked at him with a smile and said, "I came to bring you lunch." Then I arranged the lunchbox neatly and sat on the sofa, watching him finish eating. When I was leaving, I saw that the woman wasn't there just now. I asked another assistant in a low voice what her name was. "Yolanda." It sounded familiar to me, and she also looked a bit familiar. But I couldn't remember where I had heard it or seen her. When I walked downstairs, I originally wanted to leave. But in the end, I didn't, because I had a hunch that something was going to happen. Yolanda and Hugh's behavior these 2 days made me suspicious. I had gone to bring Hugh lunch more than once before. But I had never seen any assistant chatting and laughing with him like that. Before I could finish a pot of tea, I saw Hugh walking down the stairs slowly, with Yolanda behind him. While waiting for the car, she suddenly wrapped her arms around his waist. Just like I had done to him countless times. Her eyes met mine, and she even gave a smirk. It seemed like a provocation. A moment later, she grabbed Hugh's hand, walked around to the front of him, stood on tiptoe, and kissed him on the lips. My heart felt like it was blocked. I couldn't catch my breath for a long time. I met Hugh 9 years ago. When I graduated from university, I was a freelancer. My mother had been urging me to get married. I met him on a blind date. At that time, I was attracted to his good looks. After adding each other's contact information, I kept sending him some messages. I also invited him to go to the movies or have tea from time to time. Back then, he wasn't as successful as he is now. His company only had a few people. When I heard that he was recruiting, I went to apply for the front desk position. He looked at me at eye level and joked, "Miss Celeste, I'm not selling myself." I met his gaze and let out a low laugh, casually saying, "It doesn't matter, President Hugh. I can court you slowly." The salary he offered was low, and I had to work part-time as his assistant. At that time, I was thinking, besides me being attracted to his looks, would anyone else apply? After applying, with so many things going on, would they quit? After that, when he went out for business dinners and drank, I would drink for him instead. The two of us got drunk and supported each other to go home. It took half a year like this before we finally confirmed our relationship. The person I had pursued with so much effort. It turned out that he could be so easily snatched away by someone else. I walked out of the tea room slowly, looking at Hugh's face and the figures of the two of them hugging each other. My whole body was shaking. I originally thought it was just my illusion. But when the illusion became a reality, I found that I couldn't say a word. Hugh saw me, pushed Yolanda's hand away, and walked slowly towards me. He grabbed me and looked at me with his affectionate eyes. "Celeste, let me explain." I looked up at him and gave a faint smile, asking rhetorically, "Explain what?" "Explain how you cheated on me and why you did it." I pried his fingers open one by one. Looking at him, I let out a low laugh. I had always thought that we had been together for so long now that our feelings had faded. This relationship had become ordinary. In the future, we would be both lovers and relatives. But cheating? I never expected that. Tears ran down from the corners of my eyes, wetting my cheeks. He wiped away my tears and kept saying that he would explain to me. But except for saying that he would explain, he didn't say anything else. His appearance was really laughable. I looked at Yolanda and said, "I'll let you two be together." Because besides that, I didn't know what else I should do. When I was with Hugh, we didn't even have a wedding, nor did we buy a ring. At that time, he was short of money and said that after marriage, when there was a chance, he would definitely give me a grand wedding. I didn't wait for the grand wedding he promised. Instead, I first waited for him to cheat on me. It was really ridiculous. On my way back, I somehow walked into a boutique. It was the one we used to visit before we got married. The owner had already changed now. I used to like buying some small things very much. When Hugh was resting, he would patiently accompany me shopping. He had promised me a lot. He said he would buy me a big house in the future. He said he would never go bad like other men in the future. He said he would be with me for a lifetime, just the two of us. He said all those sweet words, and I believed them. But he still cheated on me. Everything in the past seems like a beautiful dream, and now the dream has finally woken up. There was a pair of rings on the table. They cost 28 yuan and 80 cents for the pair, so I just bought them. The ring he owed me, I bought it myself. I casually threw the men's one into the sewer, and put the other one on my own hand. All those 9 years, it's all over now. I went back to pack up my things. When I went to the study to get something, I opened Hugh's drawer and there was an album inside. I opened it as if possessed. It was a photo of a young and innocent boy and girl together. They were probably about 17 or 18 years old. And Yolanda was exactly that girl. On their clasped hands were couples' rings. When we got married, I told Hugh that it would be okay to just make do with a ring that cost 1 or 200 yuan. He said, "How could I let our Celeste wear such a cheap one? I'll definitely buy you a nice one in the future." It turns out that he just didn't want to buy one for me. I finally understood why Yolanda looked familiar to me. Because when I was young, I looked very similar to her. Back then, I could get close to Hugh so quickly because I was just a substitute. Thinking about it, I suddenly let out a slow laugh. The sense of sarcasm spread, and my heart ached again and again. When I was about to leave, I bumped into Hugh, who came back in a hurry. His hair was wet from the rain, and there was some anxiety on his handsome face. Seeing that I was about to close the door, he grabbed my wrist. "Celeste, I'm not with her. Please don't go, okay?" They had already kissed, yet he said they weren't together. Looking into my eyes, he seemed to have a look of regret. I stared at him without blinking and asked softly, "Hugh, why are you begging me? Is it because your mother likes me or because you love me?" He stared straight at me, unable to say a word. Because he didn't love me. Because all these years, he just transferred Yolanda's feelings onto me. And I knew the answer. The answer was that his mother liked me. He didn't want his mother to know the news that we were getting divorced. He didn't want to change from a filial son praised by everyone to an unfilial one. Everyone in the world was more important than me in his heart. I pushed his hand away and pressed the elevator button. Suddenly, he hugged me and said in a low voice, "Celeste, we've been together for 9 years. How could you be so cruel as to leave me?" I let out a low laugh. "Yes, it's been a whole 9 years. Except for me, whose youth could be wasted like this for 9 years? I originally wanted to go back to the apartment where I lived before getting married. But it had been uninhabited for a long time and no one had cleaned it. After thinking it over, I still wanted to go back to my mother's place to stay for a couple of days. But before I got home, I bumped into a neighbor. He told me that my mother had been hospitalized 2 days ago. I hurriedly put my luggage back home and rushed to the hospital. The first thing she asked when she saw me was, "Why are you here? Where's Hugh?" I ignored her question. I poured her some water on my own and handed it to her. "Why didn't you tell me you were hospitalized?" "What's the use of telling you? I don't need you to care." She turned her head away and stopped talking to me. I was stunned when I heard her words. Then, after thinking about it, I just thought it was normal. My parents divorced when I was young. She blamed me for the reason why my father divorced her. She said that if I were a boy, she said that if I hadn't been born, she wouldn't have hurt her body and wouldn't have become infertile. She disliked me but didn't abandon me. So much so that I couldn't bring myself to love her or hate her. I was lost in thought when she suddenly turned her head back and asked me impatiently why Hugh hadn't come. "We broke up," I said. She didn't understand what was going on. She just thought that Hugh was only on a business trip. That the separation was only temporary. She told me a series of things about taking care of my husband and teaching my children. I looked at her and said in a low voice, "We got divorced." Then came the endless scolding. She called me cheap, said I was ungrateful. Back then, I insisted on being with him when he had no money. Now that things are getting better, I'm going to get divorced. "Celeste, don't bother about me. Hurry up and go back to make up with Hugh." I stared at her steadily and suddenly laughed. For my mother, it was Hugh who gave her the good life she has now. But she had never considered me or even thought to ask me why. It seems that there is no one in the world who loves me. I remembered that during the time when I graduated, she had been introducing blind dates to me. Most of them were rich, and some were even divorced with children. I really couldn't stand that kind of environment. I made some money from being a self-media person and quickly moved out to buy a house. Other parents are afraid that their children won't live well, but my mother seems to be afraid that I'll live too well. In the following days, I came to bring meals to my mother. Coming out of the hospital, I was walking slowly when the wind blew towards me. and Hugh and Yolanda were in the jewelry store across the street. I don't know what they were picking out. Yolanda was holding his wrist and looking up at him with a smile, and he was also looking at her with a smile. They looked so happy and enviable. If they were originally a couple, I would also envy them. But beside Yolanda was my husband. Looking at them, I let out a laugh. A moment later, a wave of dizziness hit me. I managed to stand still by leaning on the wall. I saw on my WeChat moments that they were preparing to get married. The divorce proceedings between Hugh and I went very quickly. We did the property division, and he gave me half of the property. After that, he said that since we were divorced, we should never see each other again. And it was as he wished. We never saw each other again. Days passed one by one. My menstrual period was delayed for a while. I originally thought it was due to too much emotional fluctuation and endocrine disorder, but this time it didn't come for a whole month. I sensed that something was wrong. I went to the pharmacy downstairs to buy a pregnancy test stick, and there were 2 lines on it. Almost at this moment, I knew that I was pregnant. I rushed to the hospital for an examination, and it turned out that I had been pregnant for more than a month. I took that ultrasound report and walked out of the hospital in a daze. My whole train of thought was disrupted. I really couldn't believe that there was a child in my flat belly now. When I got married to Hugh, I was imagining when I could have a child. If it was a girl, I would buy her dresses and tie her hair into pigtails. If it was a boy, when he grew up a bit, Hugh could take him to play basketball and boxing. But I don't know if it was his problem or mine. This wish had never been fulfilled. God really knows how to play jokes. Just after dealing with the divorce, I got pregnant. Looking down at the ultrasound report in my hand, I was in a daze. Tears spilled out of my eyes and fell on the report sheet. My heart had been aching faintly, and I was suffocating and couldn't breathe. It took me a while to recover. I went back home in a daze. From being careful at first to gradually accepting it. When I was looking at my phone in the evening, I received an invitation from Hugh on WeChat. It had the date of his wedding written on it. The seamless transition was really fast. I threw my phone aside, and then picked it up again after a while. In the end, I still went to his wedding. Through the crowd, I saw that there was a smile in Hugh's eyes. His gaze was fixed on Yolanda without blinking. His eyes were full of love. He looked at me from afar. The smile on his face froze for a moment. He was stunned for a moment. But it was only for a moment, and then he focused on the wedding again. The wedding he promised me had been given to someone else. The diamond ring he promised me was on someone else's hand. My feet seemed to be glued to the ground. I couldn't move, and I didn't even have the energy to make a scene. Before I could walk out of the banquet hall, I saw a figure passing by me and knocking over the wine on the table. It was Ethan. By the time I realized what was going on, the relatives and friends below had already pulled them apart. Ethan was looking at him angrily, his hands clenched tightly. He asked Hugh, "What did you say when you married Celeste? What are you doing now?" Hugh hid Yolanda behind him, afraid that she would be hurt even a little. He didn't answer a single word of Ethan's question. I walked forward slowly, looking at Hugh, and then at Ethan. "Ethan, long time no see." Ethan looked at me. There seemed to be sympathy and pity in his eyes. Seeing his expression, I let out a scornful laugh and asked people to let him go. Then I took 2 glasses of juice and handed them to Hugh. "Today is your big day. I wish you happiness." Celeste. Ethan grabbed my wrist, looking a bit worried. Hugh didn't take the drink I handed him. Instead, Yolanda took it. There was a faint smile on her face, looking very happy. I looked at the 2 of them and splashed the drink in my hand onto Hugh's face. He looked at me but didn't move. He looked extremely embarrassing. The juice slowly dripped down his face onto the ground, dirtying the carpet. Just like he was disgusting for living and dirtying the air. Yolanda looked at me and hurriedly wiped Hugh's face. Maybe it was their affectionate appearance that made me feel sick. I ran out and retched beside a telegraph pole. To be honest, if he hadn't sent me the invitation, I definitely wouldn't have come. Because seeing the 2 of them made me feel sick to my stomach. But I still came. I want to remember how happy Hugh looks now. If he regrets it again in the future, I can let him clearly see what he was like today. On the way, Ethan didn't say a word, just frowning tightly. I glanced at him and then looked out of the window. He and I were childhood sweethearts. My mother didn't like me, so his mother would invite me to their house for dinner. But he always had a cold face every time, which made me think that he didn't like me. So I was always afraid of him. Later, when I grew a bit older, I realized that although he wasn't enthusiastic, his personality was okay. Then our relationship gradually got closer. When I asked him to lend me money to buy a house, he lent it to me very readily and bought a house on the same floor as mine, by the way. On the day I got married, he got drunk out of his mind and told Hugh over and over again to treat me better in the future. He listed a lot of my shortcomings and asked Hugh not to be as particular as I was in the future and to be more tolerant of me. Hugh promised very well. But it was just a good promise. Thinking of those past events, now there is only a sigh left. It has been 3 years since I last saw Ethan. After he was transferred to the South City, we only met once during the spring festival. Later, because of his busy work, Ethan's father and mother would go to the South City to celebrate the spring festival. So Ethan didn't come back anymore. He parked the car steadily, leaned back in his seat, stared at me closely and asked me, "Are you pregnant?" I was stunned for a moment and then turned to look at him. After looking at him for a while, I asked, "How did you know?" "Just a guess." He opened the car door and got out on his own. I followed him closely until we went upstairs. Then he asked me, "Does Hugh know?" I murmured, "No." My voice was very low, but he still heard it. He looked at me and let out a low laugh. He laughed for quite a while before gradually stopping. "Celeste, you really have your own ideas." He coldly threw out such a sentence and then opened the door on his own, slamming it shut again. He was angry. I don't know why he was angry. I stood there, raised my hand to knock on his door. But in the end, I didn't doubt. I went back home, went back to my room wearily and lay on the bed. Closing my eyes, all I could see was the dazzling smiles of Yolanda and Hugh. My heart ached faintly and then the pain gradually spread throughout my body. Everything in the dream seemed to be swallowing me up, and I couldn't open my eyes. I saw that Yolanda and Hugh were living a very good life, having a child, and their family was happy and harmonious. But my child became an illegitimate child, despised by everyone. I held him and protected him, covering his ears, but I couldn't block out those people's voices. I struggled to get out of the dream. When I opened my eyes, it was Ethan. I was sleepy-eyed and looked at him and asked, "Why are you here?" "I came to bring you food." "I knocked on the door but you didn't answer." "I was afraid something had happened to you, so I called a locksmith." I didn't even notice such a big commotion of unlocking the door. He leaned against the door frame, crossed his arms over his chest and kept staring at me. I don't know what he was looking at. I put on my shoes to go out, but he grabbed me. "Celeste, why are you crying?" Who was crying? I had just woken up and my mind was still not working. Hearing his words, I wiped my face and then realized that my face was wet with tears. So it was me who was crying. I originally thought that after getting divorced, seeing them together again wouldn't stir up any emotions in me. But I couldn't control myself. Suddenly, Ethan hugged me and said in a low voice, "Celeste, cry if you want. I'm here. No one will bully you." I leaned on his shoulder and couldn't hold back my tears anymore. They slowly fell down. It seemed that I wanted to pour out all the grievances in my heart. I thought that the whole world was going to abandon me. My mother knew that I was pregnant and wanted to keep the child. She specially came to scold me. Then she took the money I gave her and left, cursing and swearing. I saw her leave, slumped on the ground and stared blankly at one place. I came to my senses when I heard the knock on the door. Ethan sidled in, poured the food from the lunchbox onto the plate. He came out and saw that I was still in a daze, so he called me. I turned around and met his worried eyes. I curved my lips. I propped myself up on the sofa and walked to the dining table. Even though I had no appetite, for the sake of the child, I had to eat more. As soon as I took a bite, the feeling of nausea surged up. I ran to the bathroom, leaned over the toilet and tears flowed down from the corners of my eyes. Ethan helped me stand up and said softly, "It's time for the prenatal checkup today." "I know," I replied in a low voice. From the time I got pregnant until today, it was Ethan who had been with me all the time. So much so that it gave me the illusion that he liked me. I let go of his hand and took a few steps back. "I'll go change my clothes and pack my things." He nodded and I went back to the bedroom. On the way to the hospital, we didn't say a word to each other. He probably didn't want to talk, and I didn't know how to start a conversation either. I walked into the obstetrics and gynecology department with my bag and bumped into Yolanda. She was holding Hugh's hand tightly, and Hugh's eyes looking at her were full of worry. Seeing this scene, I just felt suffocated. I took a few steps back and looked away. Then I saw Ethan grabbing my wrist and whispering in my ear, "Celeste, don't run away." I looked up to meet his eyes. When I turned back, I saw Hugh looking at me. He seemed a bit embarrassed. He didn't even say hello and accompanied Yolanda into the consulting room. Since they got married, I had been thinking about one question. When on earth did they get involved with each other? I clenched my fists tightly, digging my fingertips into my palms. Only when I felt the pain did I come to my senses. Ethan got the number for me and sat with me on the chair waiting for our turn. I saw Hugh helping Yolanda come out slowly, chatting and laughing. Hatred gradually sprouted and then spread infinitely. In the late stage of pregnancy, my emotions gradually became less stable. From time to time, I would feel irritable and want to lose my temper. Ethan would sit with me to adjust my mood. But for a long time, as long as I closed my eyes, I could see Hugh and Yolanda in front of me. It made me extremely uncomfortable. On the day I gave birth, I bumped into Yolanda again. She was going for a prenatal checkup. Ethan covered my eyes and said softly, "Celeste, don't be afraid." I almost, just almost, couldn't get off the operating table. After the baby was born, my emotions gradually stabilized. The soft little baby nestled in my arms. It made me gradually calm down. I named her Nina. I hope she will never forget me. On the day I finished the confinement, Nina kept crying. I tried to coax her for a long time but couldn't. She only gradually calmed down when she was tired from crying. Nina grew very fast. She almost looked different every day. When she was 1 year old, Ethan bought her a longevity lock and hung it around her neck. She grabbed it and kept smiling, reaching out her hands to ask Ethan to hold her. I handed her to him and said softly, "Let Uncle see our little Nina." Ethan took her. There was no expression on his face. He stared straight at me. He didn't say a word for a long time. I was lost in thought, huddled on the sofa. I remembered that day when Yolanda was doing those intimate things with a man in a private restaurant. I also remembered that Hugh sent me an invitation to the baby's 100-day banquet. They provoked me again and again. And the first time, I chose to be tolerant. So this time, I'll give them a big gift. I sent the baby across the street and went to the hotel early in the morning. I hid behind and, taking advantage of their inattention, bribed the staff who was in charge of showing the photos. He hesitated. He didn't really want to do it. But I offered him too much money, so he compromised for the money. One photo after another flashed on the big screen. The people in the hall were whispering to each other. Their eyes invariably looked at Hugh and Yolanda, as well as their child. They guessed that this child was not Hugh's at all. I watched the scene getting chaotic and stood at the back, watching this drama with a faint smile. Half a year ago, when Ethan and I went to a private restaurant for dinner, we bumped into Yolanda being kissed by a man. I thought it was Hugh. But when I saw the man's face, I was stunned for a moment. Then I quickly pressed the shutter button. I also heard that Yolanda was going to transfer the property. So I gave her half a year to hollow out Hugh. I had been preparing this gift for half a year. I also used the cash in my hand to buy a large number of shares. This is my thank you gift to Ethan. If one day I die, perhaps the only person who can take care of my child for me is Ethan. I watched Hugh slap Yolanda in the face and laughed out loud. Didn't they say it was true love? Now he's a cuckold. Doesn't he love her anymore? This so-called true love is really fake. Yolanda grabbed him, wanting to explain. But after explaining for a long time, she didn't say a single useful thing. It was just like the day when Hugh cheated on me. Hugh's mother saw this scene and directly overturned the table. Then she left without looking back. The drama was almost over. I quietly left through the back door. When I went back, Ethan was holding Nina and telling her a story. The little girl was getting sleepy. Ethan put her back in the stroller and looked at me. "Where did you go?" I hung my coat on the hanger, looked at the sleeping child and didn't answer his question. I was going to change my clothes in the bedroom, but he grabbed my wrist. "Celeste, don't do things you shouldn't do." He seemed to be able to see through what I was going to do. I smiled at him and pushed his hand away. What could I do? Don't think too much. Perhaps hearing this, he gradually relaxed and let me go. Back in the room, I deliberately checked my WeChat moments. Seeing the sighing words posted by our mutual friends on WeChat moments, I finally smiled. Apart from the saying, "One reaps what one sows," I don't know what else to say to him. I was extremely happy that whole day. Ethan looked at me as if he sensed something was wrong with me, but he didn't know exactly what it was. Nina looked at him and called out, "Dad." I was stunned for a moment and corrected her in a low voice, "He's not Daddy. He's Uncle." She looked at me, then at Ethan, and stretched out her hands towards him. "Dad, hold me." Looking at Ethan, I frowned. Seeing that I was angry, Nina was silent for a moment and then suddenly burst into tears, but for some reason, in the days that followed, she always called Ethan Dad. No matter how I corrected her, it didn't seem to have much effect. That day, the three of us went shopping in the supermarket and bumped into Hugh. He looked at me and then at Nina in the stroller and asked me, "When was this child born?" I smiled and looked at him. "Don't you have a child?" He looked down and didn't say a word. The embarrassed look on his face made me feel much better. Yes, he had a child, but unfortunately, that child wasn't his. Yolanda ran away with the child. She took away most of Hugh's assets. And now I'm the largest shareholder of his company. He's practically penniless and has nothing left. When I saw this news, I was walking outside with the child in my arms. Before I could even feel happy about it, I saw Hugh walking slowly towards me. His head was hanging low, and his chin was covered with a beard. "Celeste," he spoke weakly, and his whole body was trembling slightly. I looked up at him and hummed, "What are you doing here? Can I go to your place and sit for a while?" I didn't refuse, but I didn't let him come up either. I just stood facing him, not saying a word. Ethan came downstairs and took the child from my arms. Just as I was about to go upstairs with Ethan, I saw Hugh grabbing my wrist. "Is this my child?" Seeing him like this, I sneered, "Hugh, are you worthy?" When Ethan saw Hugh, his eyes were full of disgust. He grabbed me and shook his head at me. I knew he didn't want me to have too much to do with Hugh. But I just pretended not to see. Suddenly, Hugh hugged me. "Celeste, I miss you so much. Will you come back to me?" Perhaps he still thought I was as easy to deceive as I was more than 10 years ago. That's why he said such things. It's a pity that I'm not the same person I was when I was young. Because I know that what he really wants is not me or the child. It's the shares and money in my hands. His parents don't recognize him anymore and just let him fend for himself. I heard that he begged everyone, called everyone he knew. It's just a pity that all his former friends kept him at a distance. People all thought that a man who abandoned his wife and child might sell them out if something happened to him one day. And now he remembers me again. I pushed him away and looked up into his eyes, curving my eyebrows slightly. I said in a low voice, "Hugh, if you kneel down and beg me, maybe I'll consider it." He was silent for a while and didn't say a word. Ethan clicked his tongue and grabbed my wrist, walking straight ahead without looking back. The drama was almost over. I quietly left through the back door. When I went back, Ethan was holding Nina and telling her a story. The little girl was getting sleepy. Ethan put her back in the stroller and looked at me. "Where did you go?" I hung my coat on the hanger, looked at the sleeping child and didn't answer his question. I was going to change my clothes in the bedroom, but he grabbed my wrist. "Celeste, don't do things you shouldn't do." He seemed to be able to see through what I was going to do. I smiled at him and pushed his hand away. What could I do? Don't think too much. Perhaps hearing this, he gradually relaxed and let me go. Back in the room, I deliberately checked my WeChat moments. Seeing the sighing words posted by our mutual friends on WeChat moments, I finally smiled. Apart from the saying, "One reaps what one sows," I don't know what else to say to him. I was extremely happy that whole day. Ethan looked at me as if he sensed something was wrong with me, but he didn't know exactly what it was. Nina looked at him and called out, "Dad." I was stunned for a moment and corrected her in a low voice, "He's not Daddy. He's Uncle." She looked at me, then at Ethan, and stretched out her hands towards him. "Dad, hold me." Looking at Ethan, I frowned, seeing that I was angry. Nina was silent for a moment and then suddenly burst into tears. But for some reason, in the days that followed, she always called Ethan Dad. No matter how I corrected her, it didn't seem to have much effect. That day, the three of us went shopping in the supermarket and bumped into Hugh. He looked at me and then at Nina in the stroller and asked me, "When was this child born?" I smiled and looked at him. "Don't you have a child?" He looked down and didn't say a word. The embarrassed look on his face made me feel much better. Yes, he had a child, but unfortunately, that child wasn't his. Yolanda ran away with the child. She took away most of Hugh's assets. And now I'm the largest shareholder of his company. He's practically penniless and has nothing left. When I saw this news, I was walking outside with the child in my arms. Before I could even feel happy about it, I saw Hugh walking slowly towards me. His head was hanging low, and his chin was covered with a beard. "Celeste," he spoke weakly, and his whole body was trembling slightly. I looked up at him and hummed, "What are you doing here? Can I go to your place and sit for a while?" I didn't refuse, but I didn't let him come up either. I just stood facing him, not saying a word. Ethan came downstairs and took the child from my arms. Just as I was about to go upstairs with Ethan, I saw Hugh grabbing my wrist. "Is this my child?" Seeing him like this, I sneered, "Hugh, are you worthy?" When Ethan saw Hugh, his eyes were full of disgust. He grabbed me and shook his head at me. I knew he didn't want me to have too much to do with Hugh. But I just pretended not to see. Suddenly, Hugh hugged me. "Celeste, I miss you so much. Will you come back to me?" Perhaps he still thought I was as easy to deceive as I was more than 10 years ago. That's why he said such things. It's a pity that I'm not the same person I was when I was young. Because I know that what he really wants is not me or the child. It's the shares and money in my hands. His parents don't recognize him anymore and just let him fend for himself. I heard that he begged everyone, called everyone he knew. It's just a pity that all his former friends kept him at a distance. People all thought that a man who abandoned his wife and child might sell them out if something happened to him one day. And now he remembers me again. I pushed him away and looked up into his eyes, curving my eyebrows slightly. I said in a low voice, "Hugh, if you kneel down and beg me, maybe I'll consider it." He was silent for a while and didn't say a word. Ethan clicked his tongue and grabbed my wrist, walking straight ahead without looking back. His pitiful appearance now was in sharp contrast to how he looked on his wedding day. Ethan put the child back in the stroller and pushed it into the bedroom. No matter how much she cried, he still closed the door. I leaned against the wall, still with that faint smile. He had a livid face and asked me, "Celeste, what do you want to do?" I looked at him, hummed with a puzzled look, and asked him back, "What do you mean by what do I want to do?" He stared at me steadily and said to me, "I saw your suicide note." The suicide note was written when I divorced Hugh. I originally thought of dying with Hugh. Even if he didn't love me, he should go to hell with me. Before the child was born, this thought was especially strong. But after the child was born, I hesitated. And I never actually put it into action. I frowned and didn't say anything. Ethan grabbed my wrist and pulled me into his arms. "Celeste, don't do this." I leaned against his chest without saying a word. After a long while, I said, "I won't do it. I'll make Hugh's life a living hell. Yes, I don't want Hugh to die so easily now. That would be too easy. I also can't let my child grow up without a father or a mother. Most of Hugh's remaining shares have been diluted. I took the opportunity to have him driven out. That day, just like the day I saw him cheating on me, it was raining. I cleared out all the things in his office and lounge. By the time I notified him to come, the rain was getting heavier. I stood in the building, looking at Hugh outside the door. He wanted to come in, but I asked the security guards to stop him. Perhaps those people thought he used to be the boss and they were used to being controlled by him, so they didn't dare to stop him at first. I crossed my arms and looked at him, saying softly, "Hugh, this is how I looked that day, completely humiliated." He looked at me without saying a word. After looking at him for a long time, I curved my lips. "You have to experience everything I've been through." Nina rested her chin on my shoulder, staring at Hugh in a daze. Perhaps she had never seen her mother being so mean before, so she was a bit scared. She was 2 years old now. She looked quite similar to Hugh in the eyes and eyebrows. Anyone could tell that she was Hugh's child. Suddenly, Hugh rushed towards me and grabbed me. He was about to kneel down, saying, "Celeste, I'll kneel down and beg you. Please don't drive me away. For the sake of me being Nina's father." I carefully considered his words. Looking down at him, I let out a low laugh. For the sake of money, he could even abandon his dignity. This is not the Hugh I knew. Ethan grabbed my wrist. I looked at him and then at his hand holding mine. With just one look, he understood what I meant. He let go of my hand, took the child, and took a few steps back, leaving the space for Hugh and me. I slowly crouched down, looked at him, and asked in a low voice, "Hugh, wasn't your child born by Yolanda?" He was at a loss for words and didn't say anything. I looked at him, said "Oh," and then continued, "I almost forgot. Your story has become a joke in the circle. Abandoning your wife who has been with you through thick and thin and raising a child for someone else." When I said that, he just lowered his head, not saying a word. He looked like a defeated rooster. Yolanda was certainly at fault. However, Hugh was even more wrong. He knew he had a wife, but he still abandoned her. He lost his moral bottom line. Now, the person he loved deeply ran away with his money, and the child wasn't even his. And he remembered his ex-wife who had been with him from the beginning. It's really hilarious. Nina called out, "Dad," from behind. Hugh looked over, and I looked too. I saw Nina hugging Ethan's neck and saying, "Mommy is mean. Look at Hugh, why doesn't she recognize you? Have you forgotten what you've done?" I clicked my tongue and asked, "Do you think this is a dream?" There were a lot of people gathered upstairs, as if they were watching this drama. Just like that day when everyone was watching me. Now it's his turn. I turned around to leave. He grabbed the corner of my clothes, but I yanked it back. If this is the life he wants, then why shouldn't I let him have it? I carried Nina upstairs, put her in the stroller, and leaned wearily against the back of the sofa. There are so many memories in this office. When we first moved to this office building and got everything sorted out, Hugh hugged me, rested his chin on my head, and said in a low voice, "In the future, our life will get better and better." A good life isn't as easy as imagined. People in the upper circles didn't like him. It was I who accompanied him through one difficulty after another, walked through one tough road after another. And this office witnessed everything we had been through. Nina was sensible. Seeing that I was unhappy, she didn't say anything and just quietly watched Ethan and me. After a short rest, we had a high-level meeting. Some of the people in the meeting were Hugh's former colleagues. Ethan helped me deal with them quickly and neatly. He grabbed my wrist and slowly left the meeting room. I heard those people talking behind our backs that the company was going to change owners and would be surnamed Yi. Since I hadn't worked for many years, I originally thought of hiring a professional manager to enjoy a quiet and carefree life. Seeing Ethan holding the child, I had the idea of asking him to take the job. Ethan looked at me with a smile and asked me, "What benefits can you offer me?" After thinking it over, I thought I should show my sincerity. After pondering for a long time, I said in a low voice, 5% of the shares. But he shook his head and let out a low laugh. "Celeste, don't you know what I want?" I took the child from his hands, stared at him steadily, and after a while, said, "Ethan, I can't give you what you want." In the past 2 years, Ethan was transferred back from the South City to the North City. He had been helping me take care of Nina all the time. and I had been taking advantage of him all the time. I used his knowledge of the industry to acquire shares and strike at Hugh. He seemed willing to let me use him. We both knew clearly that he liked me. But I also gave him the benefits I should give. I gave him 2% of the shares and he accepted them. After that, I just pretended to be stupid and pretended not to know. But in the end, I couldn't avoid it anymore. I pestered Ethan for several days and he finally agreed. When he first started working, he was so busy that I hardly saw him. Whenever the door opened, Nina would rush to the door and call out, "Dad." I corrected her countless times that it was Uncle, not Dad. Ethan picked her up and rubbed her cheek, "It's Dad, not Uncle." Then Nina would look at me with her nose in the air. She was very attached to Ethan and loved to follow him around. Years passed by, and I never saw Hugh again. I did hear some news about him. His mother called me once, saying that he was wrong and deserved what he got now, but she still begged me to let him live. Even if I let him go, Ethan didn't. He launched a series of attacks on Hugh, which made no one in the North City industry dare to hire him. On Nina's 5th birthday, we booked a private room. It was Hugh who served us the dishes. Ethan looked at me, saw that my expression didn't change much, and ordered the dishes as usual. Hugh also pretended not to see me. He has aged a lot now and doesn't look as energetic as before. Nina stood on a chair to reach the teapot on the table. Both Ethan and I saw it but didn't interfere. She dragged it over and very filially made tea for me. She spilled a little and got slightly burned. Before I could react, I saw Hugh grabbing her hand, his face full of anxiety. He asked her, "Nina, are you okay?" Nina pulled her hand out and waved it in front of him, "Uncle, I'm okay." Immediately after that, she climbed down from the chair and threw herself into Ethan's arms, "Daddy, blow on it." Hearing these 2 sentences, I saw his body trembling slightly. Even the phrase, "serves you right," can hardly express my resentment towards him. Ethan ordered the meal and let him go out for the time being. When I went out to the toilet, I saw Hugh hiding in the corner, sobbing softly. Perhaps he was regretting. But regret is the most useless thing in this world. What goes around comes around. No one can escape the judgment of heaven. My relationship with Ethan is quite stable. After Nina grew up, she would directly ask Ethan for advice on many decisions, and Ethan always gave very good suggestions. I could tell that Nina was trying to play matchmaker for us. She would say astonishing things from time to time. For example, she said that her classmates said their parents slept together, so why didn't Ethan and I sleep together? I corrected her again. She looked at me, pouting, "But Mom, since I was little, Daddy has always let me call him Daddy." Hearing this, Ethan just smiled without saying a word. When we went to the amusement park, Nina held my hand with one hand and Ethan's with the other. I didn't want to hold Ethan back, so I arranged many blind dates for him. But he didn't go to any of them. Because of this, I even quarreled with him, but he was just endlessly silent. It made me wonder what the point of my making such a fuss was. Since that was the case, I stopped worrying about his affairs. My life was quite comfortable. Since Nina started primary school, I went to work in the company. Most of the work was Ethan's, and my work was quite easy. Days passed like this. Ethan had never mentioned wanting to be with me. I thought that even if he didn't get married and have children, Nina would take care of him in his old age. But unexpectedly, Nina directly asked me, "Mom, Daddy asked when you would marry him?" Ethan frowned and poked her. She hummed with a puzzled look and looked back at him, "Daddy, don't you want to marry Mom?" Regarding the child's question, I just took it as innocent remarks of a child and didn't take it to heart. On Nina's 10th birthday, we went to take a family photo. She insisted on dragging Ethan along. When I got the photo, I was stunned for a moment, but then I came to my senses soon. It really looked like a family of 3. Ethan said that there was still a long way to go and it was okay to take it slow. He said he would stay with me for the rest of his life because the love from youth would last until old age. Yes, take it slow. The future is still long.